I'm honored to be presented with an Italian nationality here, but unfortunately I'm not Italian, I'm German. The second remark is the following. When you have used these papers, once you have read them, once you do not need them anymore, you can give them back to me. Of course, if you do need them, then keep them. These points concern 10 different paragraphs, and now I'm going to begin with my conference, and I'm going to speak Italian. The Turin Shroud is the authentic image of Christ in art. It's an essay of identification and distinction. Since I learned from Suor Blandina Pascale Schlömer about the existence of the Manoppello veil, I went many times to the sanctuary in the Abruzzi, and as a result of these visits and of years of research together with the sister and Father Bolst, a book was published written by me as to the authentic image of Christ. The book was published by Heinrich Verlag Frankfurt 2 years ago as the second volume about the research on the shroud and the image of Christ in the art. When we enter the first slide, please. The first slide of this second series. The first slide of the second series, please. The first slide of the second series. It's in the same carousel. Well, this is the first one. When we enter the church in Manoppello and above the altar, the sanctuary, we see the Holy Face, we are surprised because at first no face is visible, but only an ostensory with a number of large white rectangles. The glance sees no image, only the white veil, because it is exactly put in front of a big window. If we go more deeply in the church, this situation changes. The third slide. In the sense that the veil is no longer in front of the window, but in front of the wall, and as by wizard, like it were wizard, the classical image of Christ becomes visible with the two locks of long hair. So the classical and well-known image appears of a bearded Christ with the two long locks of hair. After this first surprise, the visitor ascends the stairs at the back of the altar, and immediately he is faced with the very fine veil and a mysterious image. It measures 17 by 24 centimeters, and it is placed between two glasses in its case. The image is perfectly visible from both sides. It is transparent, just like a slide. With the permission by the fathers, the Capuchin fathers, I could examine the veil closer without extracting it from its case. It's a very fine cloth, perhaps linen or silk. The cloth has a very simple shape, and the threads cross without any complication, as opposed with the Holy Shroud, which is a herringbone cloth. The very fine tissue is transparent. We can read a newspaper if placed behind it. Here you see the church through the veil. Under the light of a wood lamp, it is no longer visible. Under ultraviolet rays, the image disappears, and this is the evidence that it is no painting. That is, it's not an artifact by an artist. I examined every thread for traces of color, and I found nothing, so it has to be concluded that the image is a result of some inner change of the threads, so that they reflect light in such a way that the human eye perceives colors. These colors change according to the position of the light source and the position of the viewer. Here we have a shade of gray and a pink. The eyes are brown, the lips are slightly red, the apples of the eyes seem slightly dissimilar. The hair resemble luminous shadows or natural shadows. The whole image seems to be a luminous shadow of a transparent face. No photography can give us the surprising effect of the original. How did this veil come to Manoppello? The fathers engaged in some researches, and at the beginning of the 16th wrote a historical report as to what could be learned about the history of the veil since its arrival in the Abruzzi town. According to this historical report, which began in 1640 and publicly read in the Council of Manoppello in 1645, the veil was sold in 1618 by the wife of a soldier to a nobleman of the town, that is, to Dr. Donato Antonio de Fabriziis. The woman presumably sold the veil in order to earn money for buying back her husband, which had been imprisoned in Chieti. Perhaps a theft could be suspected, but this is then confirmed. The woman, Marzia Leonelli, also said that the veil had been property of her family since 1507, but her brother failed to give her this gift, so her husband took it by violence in 1608 from the house of his brother-in-law. And now let us turn our glance to Rome, because there in the Basilica of St. Peter's in Vatican, a precious veil with the image of Jesus was preserved, that is the Veronica. The true image, the portrait of Jesus, which was believed to be authentic, about which so many legends had grown. This is an example of a Veronica with a transparent veil in the Frankfurt Museum. These legends had a twofold aim: to give evidence that already in the times of the Roman emperors the veil was in Rome, had reached Rome, and that the image was the result of a direct and miraculous action by Jesus. The chapel of St. Peter, where the relic was preserved, was destroyed in 1608, together with the remainings of the Paleochristian basilica, in order to make room for the modern building of St. Peter's. In 1618, Grimaldi, a filer, made a list of all the objects transported from the old basilica to the archives of the Vatican. In the list, the Veronica and its case are drawn and described separately. From the description by Grimaldi, we know that the glass of the case, which is still today preserved in the basilica, had already been broken. On the drawing on the glass, we clearly see the open eyes of the face of Jesus. On the very few copies which were then authenticated like true copies of the Veronica, the eyes are always closed. They are closed on the copy which was painted in 1622 thanks to a special permission by Pope Gregorius the 15th. And this copy is now kept in the sacristy of the church Il Gesù, the Jesus Church in Rome. All the facts and dates referred, both those contained in the historical report of Manoppello and those linked with the Veronica of the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, converge in one direction, that is, the veil was not abducted from the house of Mrs. Leonelli's brother, but the precious relic had been stolen in Rome in the time mentioned in the report. So, thanks to this hypothesis, we can identify the veil of Manoppello with the famous Veronica, which was believed to be lost, because the piece preserved in the Basilica of St. Peter has not the slightest trace of an image. If the veil of Manoppello is nothing else than the Veronica of St. Peter, we know about its existence since the 12th century. But how did the veil come to Rome, and from where? The passage of the Shroud in Constantinople was evidenced in 944, and we should hypothesize that Veronica is identical with a veil which had been transported centuries before the Mandylion. That veil is known under the name of Camuliana. The veil was brought in battles, and owing to one of the most striking victories by the Byzantine army in Arzamon in 586, the poet Teofilata Simocata says in describing the image that it is passed on since ancient century, and that it has been formed by divine art, not woven and not painted with the substances used by painters. All over the world, no other object exists corresponding with this precision to the ideas used by the Byzantine poet. Also, the veil of Manoppello gives the same impression. The image is not painted and not woven. It's an unknown art. Only the scientific mentality of our century finds it difficult to admit such an idea as formed by divine art. But one is certain, one is sure, we have many common elements between the Camullia veil and the Manoppello veil. So we should not neglect the hypothesis of there being one and the same thing. The veil of Camullia disappeared from Constantinople during the interval between the two periods of power by Emperor Justinian II. Before 705, the Camullian image presumably was abducted from Constantinople, because in that year the second governing period by Justinian, and in that year the image was no longer in the Byzantine capital. Later news tell us that the Patriarch Germanus had sent this miraculous image to Rome by sea, and this is consistent with the fact that the Veronica was preserved and displayed in the chapel built by Pope John VII, which was then embellished with mosaics, and which is in St. Peter in Vatican. This chapel was destroyed starting with 1608 under Pope Paul V. So it cannot be excluded that the veil of Manoppello, the Veronica, and the image of Camullia are one and the same object. The Mandilion of Edessa, since the day of its transportation to Constantinople, replaced the image of Camullia, which had disappeared in the meantime. So all the images of Christ in Byzantine art have a model, find a model for imitation in the copies of Camullia and of the Mandilion. But the portrait of Jesus had been known earlier, as it is proven by the Roman catacombs. The more important monumental depiction was the apside of the Basilica of St. John in Lateran, the apse of St. John in Lateran. Later on, all the mosaics in Rome never deviated from the classical type of the portrait of Jesus, so we can make the hypothesis of the presence of both images and relics in Rome already before the 4th century. We know a fresco of a shepherd in the Hypogeus of the Aurelius, which is dated in the first half of the 3rd century. This shepherd reading a roll already has the classical feature of Jesus, and this will become unvaried up to the Pantocrator in the Orthodox churches. It has been proven by Suor Blandina Pascali Schlömer that all this depiction of the face of Jesus are consistent with the two relics, and the faces of the two relics show an astounding correspondence. But I cannot neglect the fact that the Father Bulst, who is co-author of my book, disagrees with the way used by Sister Blandina in overlapping the transparent photos of the two faces. I leave to the specialists the task of judging here, and some of the objections are based on wrong references, such as that about the measures. This is due to the fact that Sister Blandina Pascalis at the beginning of her researches worked using photos which did not correspond to the natural measures, the natural size of the two objects. I made a recent visit to Manoppello, and I saw that the two images perfectly correspond in size. Unfortunately, also the illustrations in the book were not printed accurately. Now there is the objection that the blood traces, which have been scientifically ascertained with the shroud, do not correspond on the Manoppello and on the shroud. That is, on the Manoppello veil, no scientific method was applied. The other objection by my co-author is the obvious remark that on the veil, eyes and mouth are opened, but not so on the shroud. So before attempting to solve this difficulties, let's go back to the model, the one or two models. Fortunately, we have a coin dating back to 692, which shows us a dependence from the shroud. The coin, the comparison between the two was made by Paul Melanie. The protruding eyes, the distance of the locks of hair from the left cheek clearly show the dependence of the face, but it is a strange and imperfect face. The re-elaboration of the true image of God uses a number of other elements taken from another model, such as the Manoppello veil. This was the case of the Pantocrator icon. Here the overlapping of the transparent photo on the icon made by Sister Blandina is striking evidence. The classical type of the portrait, therefore, is based upon two models, the Turin's shroud and the Manoppello veil. The two were together, and perhaps they formed a single piece, one on the other, up to the transportation of the veil to Constantinople in 1554. So perhaps there were two pieces of cloth which were tied one upon the other. If we go back on times, we see that all traces, all hints lead us to Rome, where we must hypothesize the presence of this relic before of its presence in the Byzantine East. The shroud and veil must presumably were both in Jerusalem, and all the scientific data collected up to now tell us that the image was produced by an action of God in the moment of the resurrection. How there was a cooperation on natural causes with the primary and wonderful cause in the formation of these two images will be established by a future analysis. The problem of the different blood marks on the two clothes can be solved in the following way. They were caused by direct contact with the wounds on the dead body of Jesus in the first moment, and the two clothes were then again applied to the corpse and only after the second application, as shown by John Jackson, this produced the image on the shroud and on the veil. The oxidation of the image is also valid on the veil, but a little more exercise is necessary in order to see both images. The coins on the eyes left no trace on the veil of Manoppello, and I found no satisfactory explanation for this. I think that no human study will ever be able to explain everything. But the evidence we gathered so far is sufficient in order to state that we really have the real portrait of Christ.